Okay, so second recording has started for talking about the rest of chapter 4, identity. This actually should go pretty quickly since we covered like the meat of everything last week. So hopefully we just have to work on this today, and then Wednesday we can talk about some chapter 6 stuff, and then hopefully Friday should be pretty relaxed as we kind of wrap up with this, because we don't have like a PowerPoint chapter like this for chapter 6. It'll be more discussion. So we're going to talk about for this section in regards to like identity development. So how does identity develop? And then I think we move on to like culture shock before we wrap it up. So first we're going to look at the stages of minority development, and there's literally no one else in the classroom here with me, so I am going to take off my mask. Hi guys, hopefully you can hear me now. But minority identity development is within 4 stages, and I think majority identity development is also 4 stages. But when we're looking at this, we're looking at particularly US, because here in the case we are in the US, obviously if you're in a different country, then the minorities are going to be different. So if we are in China, then we as European Americans are going to be the minority. But if we're talking about here in the US, Asian Americans are more of a minority. But there are different stages. And people who are in a minority in a country tend to develop their identity earlier than people of the majority group, because if you're part of a majority group, you probably don't think about your identity as much. Like we were talking up here, like if you're part of like the middle class, we were talking about socioeconomic identity, class identity. If you're part of, if you're around people who are all around your age, if you're part of a majority religion, if you are a citizen of the country that you are in, then you probably don't think about your identity as much because you're a member of the majority. If you're a member of the minority, whether that be a gender minority, whether you be a person of color here in the United States, you'll develop this identity earlier. But not everyone experiences these 4 stages in the same way. You might spend more time in one than the other. You might move through them really, really quickly. You might sometimes regress before going back forward. It just depends. But the first stages are unexamined identity. We just aren't really exploring, race or ethnicity, because you're just thinking, maybe, I'm not going to put words in anybody's mouth or head, but you're just not really exploring it. You may accept the values and attitudes of the majority group, including even if those beliefs or values believe something negative about the particular minority that you belong to. So you may have more of a desire to assimilate into the dominant culture and express more positive attitudes, especially maybe if you're just coming into a new place, you might really want to fit in. So you're like, okay, I want to assimilate, sorry. And then your identities about identity may come from parents or friends, or the individuals may just be disinterested or not really concerned about their ethnicity. So you're not really exploring it. It might not be a problem to you at this point in time. So you're just kind of going with the flow. And then you move on to conformity. So a strong desire to assimilate and more internalize these values, these beliefs, these norms of whatever the dominant group is. So if you are a minority living in China, that might be becoming more collectivist. You might believe that it's like, oh, well, I don't fit this Chinese standard of beauty because I'm 5'11", or, I'm, more than 50 kilos, so I'm not within that, Chinese standard of beauty. So you might think negatively about yourself because you're not conforming to that particular standard. Or if you're in the US, you might say, okay, well, I'm not, blonde enough or blue-eyed enough to fit the standard of beauty. So like I said, you're internalizing the values and norms. You may have negative attitudes about yourself or your particular group. So people who criticize other members of their own group may be given negative labels. So it's like, oh, well, you know, why do you act so, you know, in the case of this, well, why are you acting so white? Or why are you acting so this way? You know, as said by other members of that particular group. You know, why aren't you acting like you should as a member of this particular minority? So this stage can definitely last a long time. It may continue until the person encounters different situations that cause them to question their superbly pro-majority or pro-dominant attitudes and beliefs. And then once they might start questioning these beliefs, you move into the resistance and separatism. So it could be triggered by negative events, encountering discrimination or name calling, so which could lead to an awareness that all, you know, not all of the dominant group values or ideals are beneficial to everyone. That's not to say there aren't positive things about whatever dominant group there is. It just says that, you know, you're coming to the realization that maybe not all of these are helpful or positive to, you know, everyone in a minority group. So this could be motivating to people to help learn about their heritage, to join clubs or groups that really emphasize this minority identity. So you could get a blanket endorsement or just saying, you know, okay, well, you know, everything about my minority group is, you know, perfect. I'm going to endorse all of it, say it's all good, even if, you know, not everything is always good. So then with that endorsement of more, you know, minority group values, you may be rejecting all of the values and norms of the dominant group. You know, all ethnicities have good things and maybe less ideal things about them. So you may be rejecting a lot of good things and endorsing a lot of bad things, and vice versa. So, and then stage 4 is integration. I think this is a really similar stage to with the same one as the majority one, but you are moving into getting more of a strong sense of self, so a strong sense of your own cultural group and the positive and negative things about them, but also understanding the other groups in the area, both dominant and non-dominant, and gaining an appreciation for them and understanding there are good things and bad things about them as well. This is the ideal outcome, is integration. You realize that, you know, bad things do occur, so racism does occur, oppression of other groups does occur, unfortunately, but redirecting that anger and, you know, that sense of justice to more positive things, like educating people on, you know, why these things need to change, you know, helping eliminate injustices for not only your group of people, but other people who might be suffering under certain rules or certain norms that, you know, punish people who don't fit those, but really benefit, you know, people in the majority or the dominant group who do. And the result of someone who has finished their integration stage is a confident and secure individuals who, you know, wants to, you know, kind of help everyone and say, you know, everyone deserves a chance to, you know, live their life to the best of their ability. So any questions on that before we move to majority development? Okay. So the first stage in minority and majority identity development are pretty much the same. The stage 1 is unexamined identity. You're not really thinking about it too much. You may be aware that there are some differences, but you're not really fearing other groups, or you're not feeling superior to them or really inferior to them. You're just kind of thinking like, yeah, this is just what it is. It is the way it is. You're not thinking too much about your own identity, And communication and relationships are not based on racial differences, gender differences, you know, sexual orientation differences, anything like that. You know, you're just friends with people. Stage 2 is acceptance. So the internalization and acceptance of basic racial inequalities in society. And these obviously differ on which culture that you are a part of, in which place you live. Obviously, if we're looking at the US, we can see, you know, the black and white racial divide. In other countries, it might be, you know, ethnic Chinese versus, you know, ethnic Muslims in the country. It might be people who are Japanese versus people who are Indonesian. It just depends on where you are from. It might be the white South Africans versus the black South Africans. It just depends on where you are. And in this acceptance stage, you may avoid interacting with people who you think as different than you. So some of the things in this one, you may have no conscious identification of being a majority, but you may think that minority groups are culturally deprived and need help to assimilate, or that your specific, you know, majority or dominant group, arts, literature, music, culture, are better or more classic, while other ones are more just like low class or folk. So it's like, oh, well, if we think about in terms of America, so like, oh, the Western civilization, you know, the Roman, the Greeks, those are all classic, and, you know, folk art from other cultures is, you know, it's just folk art. It's nothing fancy and nice like we have. They're all just different. So you may avoid communication with people who are different than you, with people who are in a minority, people of color. You may take a more patronizing stance. You know, some people never move beyond this stage. Obviously, we're trying to get to stage 4, so redefinition and reintegration, but it doesn't always happen. So you have resistance, so you move from blaming minority members for their conditions to blaming your own dominant group for these issues, or blaming the social system as a whole for these issues rather than just your particular group, because obviously it's more of a systemic thing in a lot of countries rather than just like, oh, this particular one group is at fault. So, you know, resistance may be more passive, where you don't really change your behavior, you may just change your attitudes, or more active resistance. People in this stage may feel embarrassed and may minimize their communication with people of other dominant groups, or of the dominant group they're in, because they feel, you know, ashamed of being associated with these type of people who are helping cause whatever problem this is. But with this, you may acknowledge history. So you're trying to seek out interactions with people who are different than you to try to learn what's actually going on. And then stage 4, so you're refocusing your energy on defining whatever trait it is that makes, you know, this group dominant. So reintegrate being insert dominant trait here into other facets of your identity where you may have pushed it aside previously. You know, you don't have to accept the definition of whatever dominant trait is that people have placed on you. And you know, you can see the positive aspects of being, you know, part of this dominant group again. So you can see the positive things within your majority or your dominant group, and also the positive things within other minority groups. So once again, you're appreciating other groups, and recognizing that prejudice, racism, other isms do occur, like they do happen, you know, all over the world. We like to put people in boxes and then judge them based on that. but, you know, blaming, you know, certain individuals, you know, feeling guilty about it or denying that it happens isn't really going to help anything. You have to create systemic change in order to, you know, help everyone out. So, and then you're aware of the importance of understanding who you are as a member of a dominant group. So, in the textbook I have, it has a little section on like whiteness, and as we're talking about like European Americans, specifically in the United States. So what does it mean to be white or European American in the US? And then, you know, how do we define ourselves as, you know, white? And obviously that definitely depends on who you are, and it's changed over time. So if we think about the history of isms and discrimination in the US, you know, were the Irish white? They're pretty pasty, but they definitely were discriminated against. Are Italians white? Definitely discriminated against. So the definition of whiteness changes on how many people you have within that group and how they want to group together in order to stay in power. But according to this textbook, there are 3 common characteristics shared by white people or European Americans in the US. So an advantage of race privilege, so we don't really have to think about our race because, you know, we are the majority in the US. At the current time, that will be changing over the next 30 to 50 years or so. So we have a standpoint or perspective that we look at ourselves and others and society. So a majority of those who are European American believe that race relations here in the US in particular are good. This book's a little bit old, so that might change if we look at it within the past couple years. But obviously people who are people of color or in a more of a minority, they might not say the same about race relations here in the United States, obviously because we have had multiple Black Americans killed by police in the past 5 years. You know, that's definitely an issue that people who aren't white probably think about and probably worry about. Well, those of us who are white European American, we probably don't really think about that. You know, we probably think about why people can or can't get ahead differently than people who are a minority. And we have a specific set of cultural practices that we don't really tend to recognize that we have, but other people tend to see it. So individualism is a huge one. European Americans, we tend to be hugely individualistic, while people of Asian, African, Hispanic descent tend to be more collectivists. But those practices tend to, you know, as someone who's white, we tend to not see them as much. But people who aren't within those cultural practices, who get excluded from them, tend to be able to see them more. So I probably couldn't tell you any of the cultural practices that are uniquely white because I don't think about them because I'm white. But you know, someone who's African American or Hispanic could probably be like, yeah, this is what you people do. It's like, oh, didn't even ever realize that. And then as time goes on, we do get more and more multiracial people, more biracial, people who on their census say, you know, 2 or more races. Yeah. So there are approximately 7 million multiracial people in the US. And this is, like I said, this is probably from 2012, maybe 2015. So it's probably quite a bit more now. But people who are biracial and multiracial, the identity development is different since they don't fit into a singular or neat category when we think about, you know, the minority or the majority, because, you know, they might be, you know, Asian and white. So they could be both a minority and a majority. They could you know, embrace both groups and be welcome to that, or they might be rejected because it's like, oh, well, you don't act, insert whatever group enough, you know, or you don't look enough like the rest of us to be included, which is unfortunate because, you know, should always be nice to kids. So. But it can be very positive because, you know, you can have a foot in both worlds, even if it's maybe a struggle at the very beginning. But most people tend not to find it as difficult as it could be, tend not to feel more marginalized than others. But, you know, there's definitely some benefits because you get the advantage of having the perspective of two different groups or even more. Global nomads / third culture kids, so people who grew up in different cultural contexts because their parents moved around a lot. People whose parents were missionaries or they were military and their parents moved around. These are the ones who are the third culture kids because, you know, if their parents are American, then their parents probably raised them as an American child. But, you know, maybe they lived in South Africa, and maybe they lived in Bangladesh, and maybe they lived in Japan, and maybe they also lived in Germany. So they have all those other cultures that they can take from and learn about. So because they've been adapting so many times to different cultures, they've pulled in a lot of different cultural aspects, and that makes it really interesting to see how, you know, people who grew up like that act and behave and how they adapt to new situations because they tend to be extremely adaptable. So they tend to be very resilient, tolerable, or tolerant, I guess, because they've been around so many different types of people, a little more worldly, so they know what different places around the world are like. And that helps them be extremely successful in a world where we have to talk to a whole bunch of other people in order to be successful. And then in regards to identity and adaptation, so the U curve, culture shock is really fun. If you've ever traveled really anywhere, you know, it could be within the United States, it could be outside the United States, you probably have experienced some degree of intensity of culture shock. So this U curve theory is, you know, the first phase before we go on our trip or whatever, we're very excited, we're anticipating what's going on, especially if we are choosing to do this. So let's say you're going on vacation to, the Philippines. You've chosen to go here, you're really, really excited. You get on the plane and you're like, heck yeah. You do your first couple days and then the culture shock starts to come in. So you're high up here on the anticipation and then you drop down to the culture shock of, oh my gosh, what have I gotten myself into? Because the situation might be very unfamiliar. The food in the Philippines might be really not what you're used to. Maybe you get sick because you're not used to it. Maybe you accidentally drink the tap water, so you're not feeling good. You could be disorientated. You know, if you don't speak the language, how are you communicating with people? People greet each other differently. How do you behave in a restaurant? If you want, you know, something to drink, how do you wave over the waiter? Do you stick, you know, a finger up? Do you just yell at them? What do you do? It can be very, very confusing. And then the third phase, we're going back up on that U curve, is where we're learning these new rules and customs. And it does take time. I mean, sometimes culture shock can just be for, you know, a couple days, maybe a week, and then you adapt. But it just depends on the individual person. But it pretty much happens to everyone to some degree. Even if you've been traveling, you know, half your life, there's always still things that will be unfamiliar that you will have to learn. So culture shock is totally normal, but it's interesting to think about because you know, once you get to that bottom of that U where you're culture shocked, you're in the lowest dumps, it gets better. So So living on the border, so living between multiple cultures or between two cultures, you're building a new sense of self. You're building a new multicultural identity. So now you're not just, you know, the one thing. You are bringing in different aspects to become more multicultural. So instead of maybe thinking of yourself as an American citizen, you know, a citizen of the world, you know, as cliche as that sounds. You know, if you're thriving on the margins, you might be a cultural broker, where you're helping other people learn. If you're encapsulated, you might feel torn between the two. So let's say that you are from India and you marry an American. So you might try to assimilate, but maybe it never feels comfortable. Maybe the way your new spouse does things is just, you think it's not right, it's wrong, even if you really love them. But, you know, you might encapsulate your native identity to try to say, okay, you know, let's just try to, you know, if I have pressure from my parents to act one way and pressure from my spouse to act the other, you know, what do I do? I'm kind of stuck here in the middle. Constructive, you're thriving on the margins. You are very much, you are good at what you do. You're good at talking with people from all over, especially between the cultures that you might be stuck between, but you're not really stuck because, you know how to handle it. And then intercultural personhood, so you're living on the cultural borders and this gradual process of evolution. And then post-ethnicity is a growing willingness to cross cultures and the evolution of a nation in which personal identity is fluid and shaped more by personal identity preferences than by skin color or ethnic heritage. So it is a more recent phenomenon. There's a lot of social barriers to it because, some people, we're not really at that stage in the world yet where people can, people are still very much shaped by our ethnic heritage and our race. Not to say it's bad. That's just currently, it is what it is. And, it still continues to reflect disparities between who has what power. So what might be some reasons we're not yet living in this post-ethnicity or post-race society? So depends on who you ask. But just as a wrap up, identities are not a smooth process. They happen in spurts. They're created through communication with other people. They're multiple, so you're not just one thing or another. They are dynamic, so they are changing. They develop in different ways in different cultures. They may be created by existing social contexts and structures in relation to group membership, but that still requires interacting with other people, and are complex and subject to negotiation and subject to change. So some ways to build our skills and some things to think about. Just become more conscious of your own identities and how they relate to how you communicate with other people. Try to think about what stage in identity development are you in? Can you pin it down? Do you know? And it's, not bad to be in any of the stages. It's just, we know which ones we want to be working towards. Be aware of how you assign identities to other people. How do you assign identities and traits? Do you just look at someone and say, oh, they must be X, Y, Z? If you think that, why? Practice communicating with people in ways that it helps affirm their identities and how they choose to identify themselves. So if someone says, please, call me this or refer to me as that, try to respect that because, you'd like the same thing, wouldn't you? And then, talk about it with your friends. Like, how do your friends identify? Do they consider themselves, just American? Do they consider themselves, hyphenated American something? Just the more interacting and the more communicating you do, the better you will get at it And the more you will learn, the more you will open up. So any questions, comments, or concerns about any of this? And I know it took us 3 days to do this, so I know it was a lot. And, you know, I know there was a lot of stuff in here that is not 100% comfortable for people to talk about because, you know, it is still really hard to talk about, you know, race and ethnicity and sexual orientation and how those affect who we are, you know, in certain times in certain places. So before I stop the recording, any thoughts?